scholars. It's a great pleasure to extend greetings to every participant of this panel and welcome everybody in the frameworks of international and interdisciplinary conference, challenges of source evaluation in science and correlated areas. So we are just about to start the 5th online panel discussion, which is dedicated to the first part is whether a reputation of an author is a guarantee of his reliability of the work. And the second part of the panel would be dedicated to accuracy of scholarly information and priority. My name is Kanykei, and it's a great honor to be your moderator on this panel. Let me please present our speakers in the order they are given the floor on today's panel. Dr. Emilio Viano, President of the International Society for Criminology, President at Bellagio Forum for World Security and Social Development. He is on the Harvard University list of national security professors. Dr. Viano is an editor-in-chief of the International Annals of Criminology. He's a member of the board of directors of the International Association of Penal Law and of the International Society for Social Defense. We welcome you, Dr. Viano. Professor Jerome Krase, Emeritus Professor, Sociologist, Murray Copeland Professor, School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Krase is an expert in sociology, gentrification in Brooklyn, Brooklyn ethnic groups, Italian-American politics, culture, race, class, urban life, and ethnicity in New York. One of his recent books includes Race, Class, and Gentrification in Brooklyn. He's a public activist, scholar, and serves as a consultant to public and private agencies regarding urban community issues. We welcome you, Professor Krase. Professor James Finkenauer, organized crime expert, author, distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University, former director of the National Institute of Justice, Washington, D.C. Dr. Finkenauer is an expert in human trafficking, juvenile and international criminal justice. He's an author of numerous books on Russian organized crime in the United States. We welcome you, Professor Finkenauer. Dr. Bernardo Attias, professor in the Department of Communication Studies at California State University, Northridge. His research focuses and emphasizes cultural approaches to communication studies as well as communication-centered approaches to cultural studies. The emphasis of much of his work is on the political economy of mass-mediated events. He has written on media coverage of the war in the Gulf, on the politics of psychoanalysis, on the rhetoric and politics of hip-hop culture, and on the drug war. We welcome you, Professor Attias. And Professor Maxim Lepskiy, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor at Zaporozhye National University, Head of Research Board in Social Forecasting, Sociological Association of Ukraine, and Academician of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. We welcome you, Professor Lepskiy. At the beginning of this meeting, let me please say a couple of words about the format of the panel. We are going to have 2 questions for the discussion that were provided in advance to each speaker. Every speaker is going to have an opportunity to answer the first question up to 8, maximum 10 minutes. And after that, once we hear every opinion, we are going to move to another issue. As for the breaks, we're not going to have officially any breaks. However, as usually, you are always welcome to grab a cup of coffee, tea, whatever it is, or use the bathroom. Just make sure that your microphone is off. So the first question of today's online panel discussion is, does the authority of an author guarantee the accuracy of scientific information? And just as a side note, when we use the word science in the frameworks of this conference, it is related also to social sciences and humanities, not only hard sciences. And so with this, we give the floor to Dr. Emilio Viano.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity. I think that the brief answer to your question is that normally one can assume that if someone is an authority, he or she will continue to be an authority. This doesn't necessarily mean that one has to accept what they say and their conclusions and their publications on faith. There is obviously a presumption that if they have a reputation, if they have a name, if they have performed before, if they are accepted by the international community, that they will continue to be persistent and consistent with the quality of their work. I think, though, that today, with all sorts of sources of information that are becoming available, the fact that we are often under pressure in producing and in presenting, the fact that the websites can provide information that can be at times contradictory, it is always important to verify the sources, to double check the data, to examine for logical reasoning, and to review and evaluate the conclusions. So in a sense, I think that the old assumption that if one had published a couple of books, that person was totally reliable, today is not valid anymore. I would say that because there is more pressure on us to be productive, because through the internet and other means, we are writing more, because there is more competition and therefore contrasting viewpoints, it is harder to maintain a reputation that is controlling. In the past, publishing 1 or 2 books or 3 books was certainly a hallmark of someone that had achieved high status. Books were not updated very frequently. As a matter of fact, there was a whole industry in Europe and elsewhere to reinforce a book. One would buy a book and then bring it to a special shop where sturdier binding would be applied to the book, because one was thinking it would keep him for 10, 20, 30 years. Today, this is definitely not the case. As a matter of fact, different editions of textbooks and other books are the norm, possibly at times for financial considerations. But so this eternity, or at least long-lasting reputation, is something that cannot be guaranteed. So my reply, and I keep this short because we have so many speakers, is that yes, the presumption is that if someone is an established author and his previous work is credible, authoritative, well documented, well presented, with reasonable conclusions, we can continue to think that this is the case. But it is not anymore like in the past, where this authority was established basically for a long time. We have to continue double checking, because also there are different methodologies, different sources of information, different databases, and therefore distilling all of this into a theory, into findings, into evidence is much more complex and suitable and liable to being debated and even challenged.
Thank you, Dr. Viano. Thank you. Is this it, or would you like to continue?
No, I'm fine.
We still have time.
For now, I am fine. I assume that we will have a discussion.
Right. So thank you. And we give the floor to Professor Jerome Krase.
Okay. Professor Viano has, even in a relatively short answer to the question, has probably covered all of the major points in it. The only thing I could add is to phrase the question as it was put: does the authority of an author guarantee the accuracy of scientific information? And then ask, mostly important, is where does that authority come from? I think it makes a very, very big difference how the person has attained this position within the hierarchy of petitional a particular professional field to become an authority. I think in general, it's easy for most of us to recognize as authorities those people in our field who have are essentially the classical people in the field. But after that, I think it becomes very important for us to say, well, where does this authority come from? The authority supposedly comes from the people who have read the work, understood the work, and criticized the work. And Professor Viano is very, very correct on this particular point, that in the current world, there's so much information production that people can rise to a position of authority very, very quickly, simply by almost like Twitter or Facebook, almost by the kind of thing in terms of the likes that they get. In other words, so if we look at authority as popularity and reputation, right, as opposed to established authority by people in the field who are sufficiently trained to make those decisions, it becomes a different question. So I think a lot of us, depending upon the field in which you're working or the subject in which you're working, run across this problem frequently, as I do. For example, when I do work on gentrification, and I do a great deal of study in this area, both looking at other people's work and trying to develop new additions to the work on gentrification. What I've noticed is that almost every article I read, almost every chapter I read, has the same introduction. Almost exactly the same. I say to myself, sometimes I don't want to read the introduction because I've read it 20 or 30 times already. And what has happened, and this is we have to understand that science is a social organization, right? And so what has happened is the scientific organization has established a hierarchy about who it is that we are supposed to read and we are supposed to quote. And what that has led to, I know in the field of gentrification, is very little critical work being done, because in a sense, the lesser people in the society of science feel that they must cite these people, right? And they must have their work relate to those people, before they can go on. Right. And so I see this as a social problem more than a scientific problem. It's not that one might say their work isn't particularly good or not particularly valid or not particularly reliable, but this problem of authority within the discipline makes people less critical. Who will criticize the authority in the field? Now we know from the structure of scientific revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, etc., how difficult it is to challenge paradigms once they've been established, right? And so the only thing that I could add to this is to think of that question as one which should bring us to try to understand the social organization of the sciences in which we participate as social members, right? So that's basically the way that I would look at it. And I think what people seem to see as authority is reputation, right? And so we've come to respect certain people. It's not a bad idea to respect people, often uncritically. And this is particularly true for younger people.
Thank you, Professor Krase. And we give the floor to Dr. Finkenauer. Please unmute yourself.
All right, thank you very much. I heard a dog somewhere. I don't know if anyone else heard this dog. Okay. Okay, on the one hand, this is an interesting question. On the one hand, my answer to that question is quite simple. No. One ought not to only depend upon the reputation of and the authority of the scholar in terms of believing the results. But as in the paper that I had prepared as a background paper for all of this, I talked about the peer review process and some of the issues that surround the peer review process. And having spent many years as a peer reviewer in a variety of settings with journal articles, reviewing book manuscripts, doctoral students' dissertations, a whole variety of things, you realize the degree to which you're dependent on the honesty of the people writing these things. For example, if they tell you that they've collected certain kinds of data and they have this sample and they have these many people and they did these things over this period of time, basically you have to trust that they're telling you the truth, because you don't really have the capacity to go back and re-examine everything that they're telling you and get all the data and do all the analyses yourself and so on. So you have to trust in this. And as a consequence of trusting in that, the reputation of the author becomes important, because then you have to think to yourself, has this person published before? Do they have a good reputation in the field? Are they seen as a good scholar and recognized as such in the scholarly community? And if so, it gives you some confidence, more confidence in trusting the results. So we basically, as peer reviewers, make a presumption about researchers being honest and having integrity in what they write and what they submit. And most of the times, I think that's, there's not a problem with that. I think that most scholars do, in fact, present the material honestly and with integrity and so on. Unfortunately, not all the time. There are numerous examples of this, and one of the examples, again, that I pointed out in my paper, a well-known criminologist, goes back a couple of years ago now, a well-known criminologist published a series of articles with some other authors in some highly regarded social scientific journals, criminological journals. 6 of these articles have now been retracted. And the reason why they were retracted is not because the peer reviewers at those journals detected some problem, but because one of this scholar's former graduate students, who himself is now an assistant professor, read one of these articles and realized what was being said in the article was not accurate. And they had participated in the research themselves and therefore knew this. And there were issues about, actual falsification of the data and talking about sample sizes that were way different than what the actual sample sizes were. And once you have that little red flag, then you investigate further. And as it turns out, this particular senior author refused to release the raw data that would allow people to double check to see who was right and who was wrong in this process. So that says that not all the time could, and by the way, this person has a named chair in a major university. So they have a scholarly reputation that's been built up over a number of years. So it says that most of the time you can trust, but not all the time. Now, why would this be? What could happen with some senior scholar or senior author that might bring about something like this? Well, one of the things that happens is researchers who are very busy, they get a lot of grants, they're doing a lot of things, they get overextended. And one of the things they begin to do is rely on research assistants who are often graduate students who are working with them. Now, I'm not suggesting that the graduate students are being dishonest. What I am saying is that graduate students can make mistakes and they may make wrong judgments and they may do some things that are wrong. If the overseeing person, the senior author, is not really in a position to be closely supervising and working with them all the time, they may not pick up on those. They may not see that something is wrong here and this doesn't seem to fit, and all they're doing is putting their name on it so that the thing can get, a graduate student is not going to get something published in a major journal. So the senior author's name has got to go on this piece in order for it to get published. So somehow they get their reputation accounts for it getting in the journal, but they're getting attached to something which is in fact erroneous. It's also, and that links to the issue of the inability of the peer reviewers to be checking everything. They just don't have the ability and the time to be doing that. So now you've got some problems with something that's been submitted and it gets accepted and published in the journal. But you also have, in a more nefarious kind of way, you got senior researchers who know they have a certain reputation and they use that reputation. They know that if they submit something, it's highly likely that it's probably going to get published, and they know that the stuff can't get reviewed with a fine-tooth comb, that nobody's going to go back and look over all the stuff and so on. And so they utilize their own reputation and their own authority to perhaps, not doing outlandish things, but let's say less than high quality work that's being produced, and they're getting it published. There's an interesting thing I've seen with some senior scholars. I once worked with a woman who was a psychologist. I worked with a number of projects. In every paper that she wrote, she cited herself. She would cite almost everything that she'd ever published in every new paper that she wrote. Now, why would one do this? Because there's something called the Citation Index. And what happens is you get credit when people cite your work. So if you cite all your work all the time, and then you assign this work to your students and they cite all your work, you're building up your citation index. Is that totally dishonest? Well, no, except it gives a misleading picture, certainly, that somehow people would look at this and say, well, this person's work has had a great impact on the field. Well, not necessarily, because most of the citations are from themselves to their work. The other thing that can happen, and this is the flip side of the citation thing, people who produce a terrible piece of work on an important issue, that piece of work could be used as the case example of what not to do, and it gets a lot of citations as this case example of what not to do. So in terms of the citation impact, it's great, but for the opposite reason of what one would hope for from the citation impacts. So again, can you depend on the reputation of the researcher? Maybe, cautiously. Be very careful about looking at where did the work come from, who worked on it, and so on. And most of the time, you're going to be safe in doing that. Sometimes mistakes are going to occur, or outright fraud, as happened in this particular case that I cited, is going to occur. And therefore, you see research get retracted as a consequence of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Finkenauer. When you were speaking about the journals, I just remembered this outrageous event, such as Sokol affair, that I was just studying several months ago. Thank you. And now we give the floor to Professor Bernardo Attias, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, and I'm glad you brought up the Sokol affair, actually, because that was one of the first things that came to mind when I read the question, in terms of an example of somebody who kind of intentionally disrupts, the peer review process and the process of a trust that's been addressed here. That certainly there's an expectation within academia that we do rely on trust to a certain extent, and the peer review process. The peer review process is not about fact checking per se. It's not like in journalism, where you have people who are trained to look up, facts to check to make sure they're accurate, who are trained to check on sources and all those kinds of things. When people peer review papers in academia, generally we're looking for is the research that we see here cited properly? Are they missing anything, right? Are they are they missing any big important aspects aspects of the research that they're talking about, and are they making a contribution to the field? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that we ask as reviewers. You know, we generally, if I'm reviewing a paper, so my field is communication studies, and I want to talk about that in a second. But if I'm reviewing a paper in my field in communication studies, and somebody is writing about communication studies of a particular area that I don't have a lot of information about, like you know, if they're writing about communication in criminology, for example. I'm not a criminologist. I don't have the background in criminology, and I don't really have the expertise to go look up specific facts to see if those facts are correct. So I'm trusting that author that those facts are accurate, and I'm evaluating that paper based on those other criteria. So the peer review process does not necessarily weed out unfactual information. And the SoCal affair, you know, is a great example of where a scholar, in order, I think, to catch a journal, you know, journal's editors with their pants down, so to speak, you know, kind of intentionally used false information and, you know, worded it in such a way that it sounded like a legitimate argument. Now, you know, personally, I've actually read that paper, and I do find a lot of fault with the peer review process in that particular journal. I think they made a big mistake accepting that paper, even without the scientific knowledge that they would have needed to evaluate the facts in that article. But that's a different question. You know, the problem really is presented because somebody disrupts that dynamic of trust. And as Dr. Krase pointed out, you know, this is really a question of a social rather than a kind of scientific question. You know, the question of authority is really a question of social. You know, who is giving people authority, and on what grounds are they giving them authority? So as I said, my background is communication studies, and it's specifically, you know, I'm you know, my expertise is in rhetoric, and in classical rhetoric, you know, we actually look at questions of authority as part of what, you know, if we go all the way back to Aristotle said that, you know, in public speaking, there are 3 forms of proof, and those forms of proof are what he called ethos, pathos, and logos. Logos being rationality, reason, you know, weighing the facts, and you know this kind of thing. Pathos being the appeal to emotions, and then ethos being credibility, authority, or really, you know, for the Greeks, ethos means character. So the character of a speaker, you know, was part of what, you know, people used to evaluate whether what that speaker was saying was true or not, and whether they were convinced by the speaker, is based on, you know, their character. And their character, you know, may be based on reputation. It may be based on, you know, just their inherent qualities of public speaking. Somebody maybe sounds more credible than someone else, you know, and so forth. And Aristotle warned even way back then, you know, that ethos was actually the most powerful form of proof. And Aristotle, you know, as most people know, you know, was a strong believer in reason, right, and in the power of logos. But nevertheless, you know, he felt that ethos was actually how people convinced other people, and that there was an inherent danger in that people could use their authority in a way, in a manner that was unethical, that could, you know, as some you know, philosophers at the time feared, that it would, you know, lead people to make false things seem true and make true things seem false. You know, I think, you know, the SoCal affair is kind of an extreme example of something like that, where somebody, you know, kind of intentionally disrupts that process of trust. So what I would like to do is actually turn this question around. Instead of asking, does the authority of an author guarantee the accuracy of scientific information? I would like to ask if an author's, you know, reputation for accuracy in scientific information will enhance their authority. And I feel like, you know, one common theme in what people have said so far in this panel is that recent years, you know, have changed things in some ways, you know, whether it's because of the increase in the importance of publication, whether it's and then the glut of information that we find ourselves in, whether it is the increasing difficulty of looking up, you know things to check on them and so forth, or whether it's, you know, the political climate, which does lead to things like the SoCal affair, which was, you know, politically motivated. I mean, you know, he felt that there was a field of, or an area of the field of scholarship that he was writing in that was really kind of letting politics get in the way of their scholarship. So, you know, those kinds of questions sometimes lead to, you know, something that I think, you know, I think what so-called did was unethical. It disrupted that process, and it disrupted it based on a certain amount of trust. And I think that was due to, the political climate. And we think we're seeing an increasing politicization of scientific and social scientific research across the board, you know, particularly when you look at areas like climate science or, sex education or things like that have become increasingly part of the public policy sphere as well. So there's a lot of issues here, and one of the things that has shifted, I think, is that in the political sphere we see more and more people rely on something like reputation or something even like the feel-good qualities of a public speaker or a writer. Well, this person makes me feel like I feel about myself, right? That's why we hear time and time again that's how people vote for candidates, and I think that puts the cart before the horse in a lot of ways, and it would be I feel maybe nostalgic for something that never existed, but I feel like there might have been a time when that reputation and that authority was established through and a reputation for accuracy or for well established scientific or social scientific research.
Thank you, Professor Bernardo. And now we give the floor to Professor Maxim Lepskiy.
Спасибо большое за предоставленное слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
И, во-первых, хочу пожелать хорошей экспедиции моему коллеге, другу и экспедиционному корпусу, которые сейчас находятся в Хорватии и изучают очень интересную проблематику.
And first of all, I would like to regard my best greetings to my friend and my colleague, Dr. Oleg Maltsev, who is now in Croatia and conducting a field research activity with Expeditionary Corps, and he could not join our panel today, but he'll watch it later on.
И хочу поделиться тезисами по отношению к первому вопросу.
And I would like to present my theses in regard to the first question of the panel.
Во-первых, хочу, как и мои коллеги, сказать, что авторитет не является характеристикой надежности исследования.
So in the first place, I would like to highlight, just like several of my colleagues on this panel have already mentioned this, that an authority or reputation of a person is not a guarantee of the reliability of his work.
У нас ровно год назад тоже провели подобный эксперимент, и во все украинские журналы были направлена фейковая статья.
A year ago, there was something very similar to Sokol affair that had happened in Ukraine when scholars wrote several articles that were like really nonsense articles, and they were sent to many peer-reviewed journals in the Ukraine.
Мои коллеги приносили эту статью и говорят, это ерунда, ее не стоит публиковать, и мы ее не опубликовали.
But at that moment, the editorial board of several journals, they understood that the article is, it's not relevant for the journal, and they didn't publish it.
Хотя на эту удочку попались около 10 украинских журналов научных.
Even though around 10 academic journals in Ukraine did publish that article.
В этих статьях было все, актуальность, в общем, вся структура, которая должна была быть в научной статье. Но содержание было абсолютно бездарное и фейковое.
So the article that was distributed among the journals had all criteria of the academic paper. It was relevant, it has the structure, the proper structure. The only thing, the content was absolutely fake and absolutely nonsense.
Но часть журналов взяли эту статью по одной причине: не хватало научного мужества сказать нет.
However, as I have mentioned, some journals did accept that article for the simple reason they did not have scientific courage to say no.
И часто авторитет ученого связан с тем, что это либо положение в иерархии, то, что Пьер Бурдье связывал статусно-ролевыми позициями с хабитусом.
So when it comes to the reputation, the authority of a scholar, we are dealing with several factors, and one of them is what Pierre Bourdieu used to explain as a hierarchical status role thing.
Или же это связано с гетерархией, горизонтальными балансами, договоренностями между социальными сообществами ученых.
Another factor might be the horizontal balance, not the vertical one, when there is a certain agreement with certain entities horizontally.
Мы сталкивались с нашими коллегами, когда серьезное научное исследование, а часто даже расследование, приводило к большому шуму в средствах массовой информации и атаки на научную позицию.
So my colleagues have faced situations of serious, I would say, investigation of a scholarly work, which ended up being a huge, almost like a scandal in mass medias when all of the vectors were pointed against the scientific community.
Это часто связано с социологией, которая замеряет самочувствие общества.
Самочувствие общества.
Самочувствие общества.
It is,
Напряжение в обществе, можно так.
it is frequently related to the sociology, basically to the tension that exists in the community.
И мы часто вспоминаем слова известной комедийной актрисы Фаины Раневской, что о вас говорили столько гадостей, что точно вы очень хороший человек.
And here Professor Levski is giving an example of a joke, which is probably more understood by Russian speakers, but I'll try to translate it. That he says, we frequently remember the words of comedian, actress, very famous lady that used to live before Faina Ranevskaya. And her phrase was the following: oh, there are just so many garbage told about you. You must be a good person.
Поэтому репутация часто связана с позициями, которые связаны либо с отношением к государству и государства, или средств массовой информации.
So thus a reputation is something which usually is formed or is a relation with a government or with mass media.
Еще один важный фактор в том, что авторитет не всегда соответствует научной точности, это вероятность ошибок в научном исследовании у каждого человека.
Another factor about the authority of a scholar and that relation to the reliability of the work is the thing that we have to always remember, that there's always a probability of making a mistake in the research work, because every scholar is a human being at the end of the day.
Мы часто нашим студентам говорим, что у вас есть право на ошибку, только вы все равно должны вычищать методологию и методику исследования.
And we always say to our students that you might make a mistake, and that is fine, but you have to always look through, you have to always revise your methodology and method of the research.
И ошибка должна служить средством познания, а не средством создания вины или отсутствия научного интереса.
And the mistake should serve as a factor that stimulates you to gain more knowledge and to become even better in your research, and not make you become disinterested in science.
Еще очень важная позиция – это, конечно, политизация науки и политизация отношений в науке.
Another important part is politicization of the science and in the science.
У моего учителя, профессора Воловика, был прекрасный преподаватель философии, немецкой философии.
And my teacher, Volovik, had an amazing teacher of German philosophy.
Он отсидел сразу после войны срок как раз за то, что он читал немецкую философию во время Второй мировой войны.
And that person was imprisoned right after World War II for the reason he read German philosophical literature during the war.
Но при этом он остался очень толерантным, демократичным человеком, который говорил о том, что это ошибка общества, а мы должны нести все-таки смыслы в это общество.
And even though he was in prison, that person stayed tolerant and democratic by telling that this is a mistake of the society, and our job as scholars is to enlighten the society and not hate it. Профессор Лепский, пожалуйста, суммируйте вашу мысль в течение минуты.
Поэтому я думаю, что эта тема крайне важна для обсуждения, и, безусловно, обращение к ученым – это обращение к людям, которые все-таки будут верифицировать те или иные положения, невзирая на авторитеты.
And I think this question is quite important. In order so that people understand, I've asked Professor Lepskiy just to wrap up his thoughts in a minute. Professor Lepskiy says that this is an important topic, and I believe that we should call upon all of the scholars to be careful and take their time and review everything they do or somebody else's work with due diligence. And at this point, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Professor Lepskiy. So at this point, we have finished with the question number 1. If anybody has questions to each other, please feel free to do so. If not, we will move to another question. Sure, Professor Finkenauer.
Unmute myself. Yes, I have actually 2 questions. One is for Professor Lepskiy. He said, if I understand it, that some part of the problem that he was describing had to do with tensions. He used the word tensions in the field. And I was just wondering if he could elaborate on that and talk about what kind of tensions was he talking about. And secondly, and I throw this question out to all of my colleagues here, do you see any evidence of what I would call an old boy network in which you have the same people on editorial boards, peer reviewers, submitting manuscripts for review, and it's kind of like a quid pro quo of, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, I get your material published, you get my material published. Do you see any evidence in your fields of that sort of thing occurring? And what is the implication of that?
We will start with the first question. Thank you, Professor Finkenauer. Этот вопрос адресуется профессору Максиму Лепскому. Профессор Финкенауер интересуется, вы упомянули о неком напряжении в обществе. И я так понимаю, профессор Финкенауер подумал, что это напряжение в некой отрасли. Вы не могли бы, немножечко пояснить, предоставить какие-то детали? Есть ли какие-то напряжения вообще в отрасли, в которой вы занимаетесь, соответственно, социологией?
Безусловно, напряжение в наших исследованиях социологических есть. Все пытаются сейчас утверждать кризис социологии, рассматривая кризис электоральной социологии.
And yes, we do have a tension in the area of sociology, where Professor Levski, it's his main expertise. And here's a quote. He says, the crisis is not in the area itself, but it's a crisis of electoral sociology, something related to like election in the field.
И второй момент связан с тем, что украинские социологи на втором конгрессе практически все утверждали о возможных конфликтах на востоке Украины. И проявился эффект Кассандры, когда социологов никто не захотел слушать.
Это нужно упоминать, когда это было по времени.
Да, это было до 2014 года.
And Professor Levski is given an example that before 2014, there was second Congress on Sociology in Ukraine. And at that moment, sociologists started telling that in the eastern Ukraine, there might be a conflict. So there was an effect of Cassandra, as he said. However, at that point, at that Congress, nobody wanted to listen to sociologists.
Вместо этого было давление на социологов вместо того, чтобы принимать конкретные действия.
So instead of taking exact or concrete decisions, they were pressuring sociologists. Thank you, Professor Maxim Lepskiy. And does anybody want to answer a question of Professor Finkenauer?
Well,
I would like to at least be the first, and then I
And then
imagine
Professor Viano. Mhm.
no problem.
Viano. Okay.
No, go on. Professor Jerome Krase, you go on, and then after that, we will give the floor to Dr. Viano.
Okay, good. Sorry. Yeah, I was excited by the question because it goes right into my analysis of science as social organization. You know, that we tend to forget. We know it, particularly social scientists. We obviously know this because we teach it. In other sciences, physical sciences, etc., they may not be as astute as we are in terms of the science of social organizations, but they certainly know it also. I would make a quick response, you know, because I've written about this. I wrote about this in Diogenes, about social organization science, particularly in terms of the battle between quantitative versus qualitative methods. And what I would want to say is that, yes, we have this society establishes a hierarchy, right? We have the leaders in the field, etc. Now, Jim mentioned, if I may say, Jim, this idea of cliques, okay, or cliques, depending upon whether we want to be more French. The idea is the cliques form as defensive social organizations for groups of people with similar ideas and similar experiences. If they get to be the leaders in the field, that clique then becomes, you know, the establishment, right? It's just like in politics. And then those people who feel excluded from that form their own clique, and etc. And so we have this battle within fields between the established and unestablished cliques, and then with each other. And I want to go back to not simply a Sokol affair. Actually, somebody who was at the Journal at that time was somebody I went to graduate school with at NYU. You know, so I know the situation personally. And that was the problem that had occurred in the social sciences, which has a long history, was the development of postmodern approaches to social science, you know, coming from the humanities. But that has a long history. When I was at Indiana University in the 1960s, there was a big battle between qualitative and quantitative sciences, and the field of ethnomethodology and phenomenology began to develop out of philosophy and into sociology. And I remember being on one side and sometimes on both sides of that particular issue. And it began then. So not only did you have cliques and you had establishments, but what goes along with this, and Bernardo could comment on this also, is that they develop their own language. They develop a language that they speak to each other with, which excludes the other. So I remember reading a rare manuscript of studies of ethnomethodology, where I knew the people involved in it, and they were using language to make fun of the quantitative sociologists who didn't understand what they were talking about, right? So it's an amazing thing. This I very seldom see talked about. I do it almost in all my work, mention something like it. But of course, I want to appeal to the establishment and be accepted, right, as all social members want to be. And now I'll leave it to Emilio, who has much better insight than I do.
Not necessarily, thank you. No, I just wanted to bring up another point that is related to this issue of controlling, let's say, publication and therefore surfacing as possibly an authority, namely, obviously, the northern part of the world versus the southern part of the world. I've been involved for a long time in international associations. I'm also the editor of the Annals of Criminology. And there is no question that there is a bias in many of these associations and publications towards, let's say, these English-speaking countries, typically the US, Great Britain, possibly Australia, and Canada, and not so much to help people from, let's say, India, Pakistan, or Zimbabwe to publish something. They are actually not seen as promising because they might even impact the abstracting of the journal or the reputation, the ranking of the journal, which is extremely important. We have created a whole system today with the use, of course, of computers and of indicators, evaluators, and quick algorithms to measure a person's productivity, contributions, and the rest, that really warp and distort what we are doing. I know for a fact that particularly in Asia, even more than some other countries, the ranking of a university and the ranking of a journal is extremely important in the competition to get published or admitted there. And this doesn't not necessarily always correspond to high quality. And it also creates then internecine fights on who has accent and who doesn't. So in that respect, I think that there is an inherent bias among us in the Northern Hemisphere to control, so to speak, the market, the publication, and therefore also the career of many, many people, and even the ranking of the publications. As far as the existence of cliques and people protecting each other, anecdotally in my career, like maybe my colleague also have, I've certainly encountered this type of stories with some, at times, a bit of documentation, where supposedly, as you know, the evaluation of proposals, let's say to NIH, NIMH, or the National Institute of Justice, or whatever it might be, are supposedly blind and impartial. But actually, at times, from what I've heard in a couple of examples, a negative reply was mostly to protect the reputation of one of the reviewers, because it is a catch-22. We have the authorities that review proposals, but the authorities also have to preserve their status. And if there is some bright and smart and creative proposal by a younger person, then might, in a certain sense, diminish the importance of the authority, the tendency is a human tendency to say, no, I am not going to allow this to pass because it will impact me. And as a matter of fact, then we also have to take into account that in certain countries where the establishment of the social sciences is relatively new, before it may be more like law and juridical studies that control, let's say, work and understanding, there are at times people that become even the controllers of an entire country. I know of a Latin American country, I know it very well, where basically a couple, husband and wife, but mostly the husband, control the field of criminology. And basically, if you are not in good standing with them, you're not going to go anywhere, even getting a job. And this also happened, and I will not make names, in the field of penal law for a time. The gentleman now is deceased, but for a long time, this person was really, a rule maker at the international level in the advancement of careers of proteges and not. So certainly, these are not surprising elements. We are all mature people. We know that life is not always fair or not always equitative or not always just. And why should academia be excluded from it? As a matter of fact, let me give you another example. which makes me go a little bit out on a limb. But as you know, in criminology, there is a Stockholm Prize. And it is certainly a very beautiful initiative. And no doubt it has brought notoriety and exposure to criminology. Well, I happen to know a few people that are planning all their lives, all the people they talk to or not, the conferences they go to or not, whom they talk to and whose lunch they crash to be next to them, if they are promising for them to inch a little closer to the Stockholm Prize. It's, for me, is an interesting example of a very good initiative, which I highly respect. Don't please take me any other way, creating negative consequences in the field. I was recently at an international conference and recently, and at the end of last year, and I knew by what I already knew, a couple of people who are vying for the Stockholm Prize. And, you know, for him, one of the members of the selection committee was also at the conference. And as I predicted, some of these people did everything, all the contortions necessary to get close to him, to crash the lunch that he might have with other people and impose themselves, and so on and so forth. I'm not mentioning these things to add to the gossip of academic world. I'm offering it as a realistic assessment that even though we are in academia, we are not canonized saints, nor, you know, Mother Teresa's, as some people would say. We are indeed vying for authority, for recognition, and for advancement. And it is a natural human tendency. The problem is that at times it distorts what we do and creates quiet, maybe underground, all sorts of activities and scheming that some people invest considerable time into to reach a certain goal that is not necessarily totally correct and totally, let's say, honest. These are just some reflections. Obviously, that one doesn't have, you know, evidentiary proof that would stand up in a court of law, of course not. But there is, in my opinion, and I cannot go into many details, enough knowledge that at times, even in the same departments, there are people that sabotage each other for advancement. And I've seen that happening. So I think that from that point of view, the comments that were made before, that plays a role also in creating and maintaining authority is indeed, in my opinion, quite correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Viano. And now, Bernardo Attias, Professor, would you like to? Okay, sure.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to. I think those are some really interesting comments about two things. I mean, one in terms of the tension, I think, between the tendency of the field to require metrics, you know, some way of evaluating, like who's, why does your reputation increase? We need some way to evaluate it, and whether it's a prize or award or something else, you know, but we need some kind of metrics that people agree on, because if we're going to say, you know, okay, this person is now an authority in the field, you know, well, on what basis do we make that decision, you know? And it is you know, in many ways just kind of an agreement of the group that that's the case, you know, but presumably that a group agreement is based on something. So we do seek those metrics, but then the tension is that those metrics then become a kind of gatekeeping. And then that gatekeeping process takes on a life of its own, you know. So in some of these examples, I think that's what's happening, you know, is that there is this kind of a residue of established power, you know, what Professor Finkenauer called the good old boy network, right? That kind of reinforces itself, you know, and then keeps other people out of it. And the corollary to that, I think, is what Dr. Krase brought up in terms of language. You know, that part of the problem is just a matter of a specialized language that develops over time, that you know, people outside of that in-group might not be privy to or understand, you know aspects of that language. again, with the SoCal affair, I mean, I think it's a great example of that. You know, he was a physicist, and that wasn't, you know, the journal's expertise was not in physics at all. You know, and actually, I remember at the time, you know, kind of joking with friends of mine, oh well, we should try to write an article and submit it to a physics journal, right? And see a phony article and see what happens if we submit it to a physics journal. You know, it really is a matter of that specialized language. I mean, I imagine the people on the review committee for that article, you know, kind of said, well, I don't understand the physics here, but, you know, this seems well written. It seems to be, you know, take the form of an academic article that would be accepted. So we should say yes. You know, so that obviously that was a problem. You know, it was embarrassing for the journal at the time. But the other aspect of that problem too is this kind of disinformation, right? This kind of intentional, you know, disruption, and it's happening more and more. I mean, it's a kind of gotcha style of you know, like I think of Saul Alinsky, you know, and the kind of, you know, gotcha journalism that is now, you know, kind of infected a lot of American politics right now, where you kind of go, you know, kind of get somebody to say something out of context or do something out of context in order to embarrass them, you know, and that seems to be happening more and more. I remember about a year ago, there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about a group of scholars who did something very like 3 or 4 scholars did something similar to the SoCal affair and similar to something that you mentioned in Ukraine, where they just sent out like hundreds of articles to journals that were all fake. You know, they just kind of made up the data, made up you know everything, and they were, I think they were graduate students and just had this massive productivity of, you know, phony articles, and probably published like, you know, 5% of them or something like that. But that was still a substantial number of fake articles that were going to be published. You know, they were, interestingly enough, trying to build their reputation on their academic reputation on doing this. You know, they thought, okay, well, we'll do this, we'll expose these journals, you know, for being fools or whatever, and then, you know, that will help us get jobs in academia. And it kind of blew my mind, because I thought, well, you know, if anything, that should be evidence of academic dishonesty at a really high level. I mean, I can't imagine wanting to hire somebody who, you know, who's willing to publish something or to try to publish something like that. It's like, wow, you know, that's nuts. But yeah, it really points to, I think, these increasing tensions that we're going to have to confront in a lot of different fields.
Thank you, Professor Bernardo. And Professor Jerome Krase, would you like to say that comment?
Yeah, when Emilio was speaking, he made me think of something which is a major problem, you know, the North-South issue. But in particular, major problems in countries in the South where English is the second language, and they wish to publish in English. There's a deluge of articles that I've seen, because I review for quite a number of journals, of English language articles written from India or from Anglophone countries in Africa, or, you know, Pakistan, etc., where there's a big problem with the language, and also that the necessity on their part, or at least they feel the necessity, to publish in English or one or another European language, but English is the dominant one. And they also don't have the funds to pay for the professional editing. So I know what I do as an editor is I try to recognize the value in the submission and make recommendations about editing, etc. But in some cases, in fact, I'm working on an article right now for Urbanities, which is a very good article, but the English writing is not very good at all. But I've decided that what I ought to do is I ought to do the work myself, and I've told the submitter that I will do this work, and of course, and not charge for it. But that's another aspect of the social organization of our sciences, is I don't see too many people who are willing to do that. And I think to solve the problem of the North-South distance, is maybe the development of some funding agency. I know there are some, but they don't seem not to be working pretty well. That money tends to go to the major institutions, but something where people like that could get funding to help them out. Otherwise, they're really not going anywhere. Yeah. I mean, it's a sad story, but most of our senior scholars probably don't have the time. Yeah, Emilio, yeah.
If I can add to it, I completely agree, because I am often in that situation myself, and I'm not trying to give myself, brownie points, but I do like you do, Jerry, trying to help them and spend at times a whole day or 2 or 3 on an article. At times, of course, I wonder if that is, really something that I can sustain. But I feel a responsibility in that sense to facilitate their publishing and be recognized, because for too long, maybe we are publishing maybe not so hot articles just because they are in good English, versus helping someone that has very good data and idea come up to the standard. But it is certainly a problem. Just between us, I use quite a bit Grammarly. You may want to look into that. It helps quite a bit in the construction, but it is certainly a major undertaking, and it requires, I agree with you, a lot of patience and trying to motivate yourself that we are trying to help others advance. And I think that's something that is part of our academic responsibility too. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Dr. Viano. Thank you all of the speakers for this interesting discussion. So many outrageous cases are happening in the world that not many probably people knew of. So we are moving to the second question of today's panel, if you don't mind. It is the priority of sources and self-alignment among them, role of experiments, and what if the facts contradict science or academic work? Do such contradictions indicate an unscientific nature of preceding inferences? And we give the floor to Professor Emilio Viano.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Yeah, definitely. I found this very interesting, particularly the issue of the alignment. And I think that communication between producers and users of knowledge is indeed essential for developing credible and relevant institutional and technological solutions to all sorts of challenges. For example, the environment, the current coronavirus pandemic, many other areas of public and private decision-making. And starting with the environment, for example, there are examples of public policies for biodiversity conservation that lack the support of scientific evidence, such as recent laws in different countries. I found, for example, the Brazilian Native Vegetation Protection Law, or the New Forest Code, as they call it. Then also the Canadian Fisheries Act, and even in Australia, a law establishing a system of marine protected areas. And in all of them, there is a big hiatus between data generated by researchers and the information used by the decision makers. And of course, there is no doubt that collaboration between scholars, policymakers, decision makers may be positive and beneficial to both sides. For example, academia could better grasp how to make the research more relevant, more useful, more practical. Policymakers and decision makers would become aware of unknown facts, unexpected consequences, different perspectives, on top of making decisions supported by scientific evidence. So the crucial skill in this is how much and how well scientists have the ability to communicate their findings to decision makers in a clear, useful, and timely fashion. And we already have touched it, discussed in the previous issue, that at times scientific writing is difficult to understand for many policy and decision makers, even though it makes it possible for scholars to identify the more solid and credible results from weaker and less credible ones. Primary literature, for example, is at times time consuming to find or to identify or to access or to read, and often too challenging to understand and apply in the context of a local decision-making process. Plus, academia, as we just mentioned recently, must admit that just as in medieval Europe, Latin was the language of scholars, and the Latin Quarter in Paris reminds us of that. Even today, different disciplines have developed their own specific jargon that serves for identification, belonging, also for exclusion, and keeping others deemed not qualified away. So following the Latin example, there is no question that today most of what is published is and debated is in English. And this can be a considerable obstacle to non-native speakers of the language. Also, at times the information is reserved to members of scholarly societies or to subscribers of a certain journal. So it is more difficult for the public, including business people, politicians, to have knowledge of scientific findings. There is an open access movement that is attempting to remedy this, but there it is then confronted by the dilemma of equity and just compensations for researchers and scholars that often work and research without public support and funding. Unfortunately, this has consequences. For example, policy and decision makers often rely on their own personal experience or that of the inner circle of family, friends, supporters to make decisions rather than basing it or checking what the scientific evidence may say or support. There's been a recent study by Sutherland in the UK where they found that what is considered common sense, consulting with colleagues and other managers, were mentioned as main providers of information relied upon by policymakers there than the scientific literature that was recognized only as an original information by 2% of decision makers' interviews. And this is true also in other areas, law enforcement, the administration of justice, because the heavy emphasis mandatory, especially in the American context of statistics and numbers and tables and so on and so forth, that are often majorly outside the grasp, even of academics in other disciplines not belonging to that specialty, and so ends up being ignored or even rejected. Just an example that reminded me all of this, years ago, I argued that our university should try to offer courses in the Washington, D.C. Police Academy to try to open up a little bit what they were hearing, also from an academic point of view. And eventually this was accepted, and I myself taught at the Police Academy, and some other of my colleagues also did. The best is that when one time I was talking about it with a superior officer of the police department, I was told, as a matter of fact, that when a rookie, a newly sworn in police officer, joined the force and started patrolling with more senior colleagues, the senior officers would encourage them to, quote, forget everything they told you at the academy. It is not going to help you at all. Certainly that was kind of a flooring experience for me after thinking that we were teaching there and bringing some new ideas to them. It illustrates the hard challenge to break this barrier of credibility, authority, competence, priorities that exist between academia, research activities, findings, the practice, the application on the street and in the police station. Another experience, it has to do with the language of the scientific approach and different conceptual and epistemological ideas and methodologies. One of my brightest students years ago, one day stopped by my office and told me that he had obtained a very good job as a security manager with a very well-known oil company. This was in the aftermath of many terrorist activities, and they wanted to revamp their security, not only at the production, but also the storage and the transportation and so on and so forth. And one of the major obstacles he found, he told me that later, after he had the job for a while, was language, jargon, mutual understanding when dealing with petroleum engineers that were very well prepared for their work, both academically and professionally. But he told me at these plannings, it is as if we are all speaking a foreign language. In other words, we cannot communicate, we cannot understand where we come from. So the gap between science and policy and decision-making affects all realms of human activity. And it is a formidable challenge in order to reach a commonality of understanding and decision-making. This has happened, for example, in the Forest Act in Brazil, where it was proposed and major academic and social efforts were made to discourage the adoption of this Forest Act. But instead, it was adopted. So it didn't serve very much. On the positive side, the development of the Brazilian list of threatened species instead was much more open to scientific impact and influence. And so the Ministry of Environment recognized the importance and the weight of scientific information to support and justify introducing new conversation policies. However, as you can see, there can be ups and downs in all of this. There are other current examples of this dissonance between science, planning, and decision-making. For example, the open and vociferous denial of the reality of climate change and its manifestation, signified, among other actions, by, let's say, withdrawing the United States from the Paris Accord, for example, or opening vast areas until now protected in the USA for mining and oil exploitation, especially very remote areas of Australia, of Alaska, that have been recently been put on the market, so to speak. And actually the current administration is rushing the leasing of these areas before the new administration takes place. So there is plenty of evidence that this is destructive in the long range because of climate change, but it is ignored. It's not making any dent. Not only, it is roundly denied. A contemporary and troubling example of the serious lack of alignment between science and policy and decision-making is indeed the reaction to coronavirus. A vivid example, at least in the US, is the wearing or not of masks in public, which has been consistently recommended by scientists and medical professionals, and equally consistently disparaged by certain politicians, even at the level of the country presidency. That in the US, wearing or not a mask in the coronavirus time has become a political statement, a symbol of political support or rejection of one or the other of the candidates for the presidency, more than a scientifically supported protection and prevention measure, is indeed a vivid and current example of this dramatic disconnect, even when the risk to people's lives is very real, and the grim statistics should motivate people to pay attention and seriously, at least seriously consider adopting certain behavior. And this is not just a passing fashion item. The public perception of scientists as trustworthy experts is likely to be negatively or positively impacted by the coronavirus. For example, I found a paper, Revenge of the Experts, Will COVID-19 Renew or Diminish Public Trust in Science, that examined how the exposure to previous epidemics affected individuals' level of confidence in science and scientists, focusing on those who experienced it during impressionable years, like between 18 and 25. And it found that such exposure had no impact on people's views on the value of science as such, but it significantly diminished their confidence in scientists and in the benefits of the scientists' work. In particular, they were less confident about the trustworthiness and public spiritedness of scientists. Very interesting. And one of the authors, Dr. Aksoy, said that the findings reveal that there is a divide, indeed we know that by our own experience, between what scientists say and do and the perception of that in the public. Previous research shows that the communicator's credibility and perceived experience are key in scientific communication and gaining the public trust. So at the time of an epidemic like now, scientists are called to address the public's concern and advise those in charge. However, if scientists fail to explain their findings clearly and succinctly and fail to inspire trust, people will probably see them as elitist or inaccessible. And Dr. Aksoy also added that the government's attitude towards scientists were also really important. And we have seen it vividly illustrated in the USA, for those of us from the USA, and of course, in other countries as well. If politicians use science, for example, as a facade of authority and as a scapegoat, the public will eventually blame the scientists for not being able to deal with the problem in an effective manner. There is no question that the alignment, as the question refers to, between the scientists' priorities for biodiversity, climate change, coronavirus issues, other areas, with those of the country's policy and decision maker is essential to the success of their dialogue. So what do we do? What do we have to do to maybe succeed? Well, we must keep in mind from the start and take into account to which extent scientists and decision and policymakers agree or not about their priorities. If there is a gap, it should be taken into account and remedied to the extent possible. Second, keep in mind the sources of information used by decision and policymakers. Where do they get their information? And as we know, there is a lot of fake news indeed in this area. Third, the barriers to access scientific knowledge, as we already mentioned, for instance, just English versus other languages. And then the political, financial, and bread and butter interests that may favor or shut down public perception, willingness to at least listen to scholars and scientists, and the commitment to implement their advice and guidance. We have seen this in many countries, not just the US, where governmental measures taken, for example, to stay in place, to stay at home, not to go to bars and restaurants, and not to travel for leisure, have been ignored by people. So the difficulty, even when the numbers are staggering, to convince people that science has something to contribute and what the science tells us should be taken seriously. So
here, Dr. Viano, I hate to interrupt you.
I'm finished. I'm finished.
Wrap up. Yeah.
I'm literally finished. Taking active steps, my conclusion, taking active steps by academics and scientists to be more accessible, pragmatic, understandable is also essential to help establish the correct alignment that will make scientific research accepted, influential, and truly useful. And this is not a small task. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Viano. And we give the floor to answer the second question of today's panel to Professor Jerome Krase.
Okay. I love being edified in these discussions that we have. I learn a great deal. And I even learn from things with which I disagree. But you know, that's part of our game. The question that was posed here, I would have to, as a social scientist, as I did in the first place, would have to rephrase it, because you know, the self-alignment, I could totally agree with Emilio on it, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But then the role of experiments. Now in social science, but at least in sociology, the kind of sociology that I engage in, we really don't have experiments. And that's because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to exercise the kinds of controls that are necessary to have experiments. A lot of times what I see in my field is people talking about natural experiments where they allude to the absence of one or another variable in different places or in different times, etc. And then follow that, well, since this is not present in the present circumstances, then we have a different cause, or we see something that's present and it is a cause. But it's very difficult to do that. So I think it's not so much the role of experiments in the social sciences, but it's the role of more general research in the social science, where what we might have is the facts contradicting accepted science or accepted findings. And that, by the way, I think is what our job is to do. In other words, what it is to do, we are to go out and do our job and challenge what is accepted. In quantitative research, that's what you do all the time with null hypotheses. But in the qualitative research that I do, it has to be done a little bit differently. And that is to interrogate what people assume to be true, or what's the common knowledge about a subject, such as the subjects that I study, race and class and gentrification and things like that, and to test that. I want to mention here something else which hasn't been mentioned, and that is when we see findings that are quantitative findings in studies, if they are not conclusive, they're never reported or very seldom reported. In other words, so we don't see the results of experiments that fail. And my sense is that as far as being a scientist is concerned, that you could learn just as much from a scientific experiment that failed as one that succeeded. Emilio just talked about the COVID-19. We just had, I don't know, is Astrozenica, one or another of the companies that was coming up with a vaccine, and they reported something based on a study that they did, and thank God they then now have reported that they made a mistake, right? So we see that in the sense of public health, but if that was a normal scientific investigation, it would never be published in a journal. You know, somebody did something wrong, you don't try to get that published. Also, there's another issue that's related here, and that again, I would look at the issue of fact, and I think what we mean by fact here are accepted facts, or facts that are authoritative, facts that are handed to us that we must accept. We have to constantly test those kinds of things. Now, I know when I teach, I don't know whether you do the same, but I tell my students that do not believe anything I say. Do not believe it. You can write it down and you can say that Professor Krase said this, but that does not make it true. The only thing that's a fact is that I said it, right? In other words, so in our business, we can't go around accepting things so easily. We have to investigate further. And then there's another issue, another word that's here, unspoken, and that is the word truth, right? And that is the word truth. And this truth also has to do with the idea of trust, as also has been raised. In other words, something is true. Is something true because it's a fact? As I said to my students, it is true that I said this, and that is a fact. But what I said may not be a truth. This is a big problem with journalism today, where journalism has, whereas ethics, which used to state, or still states probably if you go to journalism school, that they're searching for the truth, right? But if we look closely at how journalists do their work and how it's published and how we receive that information, we see that it tends to be dominated by media, which is controlled by advertising, by revenue, etc. Now, we have seen this in the US presidential election, where what we're talking about is profit, not so much profit by money, but profit by political power. And it would be unheard of if we thought about, well, we have two groups of scientists coming up with two totally different views on what occurs in the world. But yet we see this. I also want to mention something, that I'm a member of the American Academy, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in which everybody's a scientist, and yet there's a huge discussion going on, a disagreement about the facts presented about electoral fraud in the United States, which you would not expect among scientists, right? So scientists would be looking at these things and saying, well, is this a fact? Who did this study? How could it be analyzed? What's the confirmation of this, etc. And it's not done that way. What happens is the truth of these matters is, as some people say, is that a truth to somebody is not true to somebody else. So we see those kinds of social interpretations. The last thing I want to say, which creates a problem, and related to what I've just said, even though the conversation may seem a little confusing, but the facts may be true. The facts are not the most important thing in terms of scientific statements, because the facts have to be put in relationship to other facts. So it's really a string of facts and relations between facts, which make for things approaching truth, meaning approaching reliable and valid statements about the world in which we live. And that's what we do in the social sciences. And so when we can have this kind of thing where we see in the public discourse, where someone will come up with a fact which is different from a fact accepted by somebody else, both facts, okay? But the statements, how they're put together, determines their reliability and their validity, and whether they would be accepted by objective minds. Okay, that may sound confusing, but that's the world in which we live, and we have to recognize that that's in fact what's going on. Facts can be true, right? But without proper relations between facts and other statements, they're of little scientific value.
Thank you, Dr. Krase. And the discussion will be continued by Professor Finkenauer.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say there's a certain advantage to not going first when one is addressing one of these questions, because I listened to Professor Viano and Professor Krase, and lots of things come to mind that I didn't have in my mind when I started out thinking about this. Let me go back to a kind of a fundamental question or response to the question. And that is that, to me, science is a set of theoretical propositions. And these propositions then get tested through experiments, and the propositions are either refuted by the experiments or they're supported by them. And to the degree to which those propositions get supported, that's how we build a base of knowledge about some phenomenon. We got consistency of findings that take us in a continuous direction and give support that yes, this seems to be the explanation of a particular phenomenon. So, but then what happens then when the experiment fails? So we have a proposition, we have an experiment, the experiment fails to support the proposition. Well, there's basically two reasons why that might be the case. One is the proposition itself is wrong. The other is the experiment to test the proposition was wrong. It was not carried out correctly, or something went wrong with the actual testing of the proposition, so it wasn't a fair test. It wasn't a full, complete test of the proposition. Let me give you an example from my own experience of this particular phenomenon. As I mentioned in my paper, many years ago, I carried out an evaluation of a program in New Jersey called Scared Straight, in which young people were being taken to the prison in New Jersey with the idea that if you take a group of young people into a prison and they see how terrible a prison is and what happens to prison inmates and so on, that they will be deterred from engaging in further delinquency or perhaps any delinquency at all. So this program went on for a little while in New Jersey, and then an issue arose about a simple question: does this work? Does in fact, if you take young people into a prison and confront them with the realities of prison, does it work to deter them? So I was asked, I was then a young associate professor, if I could find this out. So I said, yes, I can go ahead and conduct a study of this. So I did, following my social science methods perspectives. I set up an experimental design with an experimental group of kids who would go to the prison and a control group of kids drawn from the same pool who would not go. And then I would follow them up in the community to see what happened to them after this experience. And lo and behold, and I did that, and there were some problems which typically happens, particularly in social science experiments, where it's very difficult to maintain the randomization and control groups and experimental groups and so on. But I think I did a pretty good job of trying to maintain the integrity of those groups, and I followed them up. And lo and behold, remember, the proposition is that the prison experience deters children from engaging in delinquency. When I compared the outcomes of the experimental group with the control group, I found that the experimental group kids, the ones who went to the prison, committed more offenses in the follow-up period than did the control group kids who had not gone to the prison experience. Now, this was not only a failure to reject the null hypothesis, this was a reverse, flip side of the hypothesis. So immediately, now there are two reactions to this. Back to my two possible outcomes. One is the proposition itself is wrong. This kind of experience does not deter kids from engaging in delinquency. Or the research, the experiment that produced this finding was wrong. Well, guess what? All the policy people and the judges and probation departments and police departments in New Jersey who are very supportive of this program, guess what conclusion they would reach about this? Obviously, the proposition is correct, so this research has got to be wrong, okay? This person has somehow construed, they're an academic, they don't know anything about prisons, they don't understand how this works, they don't understand why this works. They're unhappy with the fact that probation officer and police officers could do something important about crime, and there they are as a criminologist, and they're not doing anything about crime. They're just studying it and writing about it, and now they want to shoot this program down. And that went on for quite a while, that sort of argument back and forth, until over a period of time, about 7 or 8 more of these experiments were conducted, not just in New Jersey, but in other places around the country. And guess what they found? The same thing that I had found initially. Kids who participated in these programs for some reason, either because of a criminalizing effect or a rebellious effect or whatever, tended to have more offenses in follow-up periods than did the kids who were in the control groups. So over a period of time, the proposition itself got pretty well undermined. Did that mean that everybody gave it up? No. There are people to this day who will still argue that there's something wrong with the research because it has a common sense idea. If you show kids how bad a prison is, they're going to not want to do the things that gets them into a prison. I mean, it's just common sense. But in this instance, that common sense reduced to a scientific proposition subject to some test doesn't pan out. It doesn't work out that way for a whole variety of other sorts of reasons. One other lesson to take from this is that one ought not to depend on a single study in any instance. I don't care what the study is or what it is that's being studied. You ought not to depend on a single experiment to tell you what the answer is to this particular situation. It's multiple studies of the same proposition over time that builds a body of knowledge about that particular proposition that tells you either it's valid and it can be supported or not. This is where I went, and somebody meant one of my two predecessors here mentioned this earlier. This is where what happens in terms of undermining science in general. We've all seen over the years science about drinking coffee, or even science about smoking cigarettes and so on, that at one time there's a consensus, quote unquote, of the scientific community about something, and then at a later time, there's no longer that consensus, and it's, drinking coffee was bad for you, now it's good for you. Or smoking cigarettes will not harm you, now they cause cancer. And people out there who are already inclined to doubt science and to question scientific knowledge look at that, and they see this on TV or wherever they're getting the information. They say, see, you can't trust these people. They all got some stake in whatever they're saying, and they change their views from one time to another, and it undermines not just that little piece of it, it just undermines science. And I think as Professor Viano mentioned about global warming, that's one of the issues about global warming. People have doubt because they see arguments on both sides, including scientists on both sides who are making these contrary arguments, and they're saying, well, who am I to question the conclusions of these knowledgeable people. Last thing I want to mention, and Professor Krase mentioned, the Astrozenica Oxford study. I'm just reading, now again, my knowledge of this comes from reading the newspaper. It doesn't come from any personal experience with what happened. Here we have an interesting phenomenon of a bit of scientific research. There was supposed, as I understand it, there was supposed to be two groups. One group would get the dosage of the vaccine and the other group would get a placebo, right? Fairly straightforward comparative control group design. Okay, that's not what happened. What happened was 3 groups got involved. One group got 2 doses of the vaccine. One group got 1.5 doses of the vaccine, and the third group got the placebo. So now we got 2 treatment groups with different strengths of the dosage, and one group that's the placebo group. Surprisingly, the group who got the lesser dosage apparently did better in terms of their ability to resist the COVID-19 pandemic and the results, the consequence of that, which on the face of it seems to defy logic. If this treatment works, why would a lesser dosage of the treatment be more effective than more dosage of the treatment? I mean, people just out there could ask that question. It seems like a logical question to ask. Another thing about this experiment was one of the comparison groups had 10,000 people. The other one had 3,000 people. Why, if you have a random assignment of people to different groups, why do you have 10,000 in one group and 3,000 in another group? That also raises questions. Third problem was one of these groups, namely the 3,000 group that had the doses of 1.5 that was the most effective, had nobody in the sample over 55. So now you got a smaller group, gets a different level of dosage, and is a younger age, when age is seemingly a factor in how well people deal with this coronavirus. So what does that do? Well, not only does it undermine, and these are not amateurs. These are well-paid researchers for AstraZeneca and Oxford University. These are people who presumably know how to carry out an experiment. They know what it is they're doing. They know how to maintain the integrity of an experiment. And my concern now is there's already a great deal of distrust in the United States, at least, about the vaccine. There's distrust just to vaccines in general in the United States. Now we have the distrust of this vaccine. This kind of news about this kind of experiment is only going to further undermine the trust that's necessary for people to agree to take the vaccine. And it's just one more example of how people out there, those same people, like the people who destructed my research on Scared Straight, will say, see, I told you so. These people don't know what they're talking about. They tell you one thing at one time and they tell you another thing at another time. So how do you know what to believe? You just got to go with your common sense and find somebody on Fox News or somewhere who's going to tell you how to think about this, and that'll be your conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Finkenauer. And the discussion will be continued by Professor Bernardo. Please
Thank
unmute.
you. Thank you. Yeah, these are really, really interesting conversation and great examples of this. And what I'm hearing and I'm interpreting this, you know, again as a communication studies professional, my one thing that I think a common thread to these examples is telling stories. And I think this is a big problem for science in the current age, right? Is that communicating to the public what the science means and what it means that an experiment led to this result or that result has been more difficult than ever before. And part of the reason it's been more difficult than ever before is because you do have entrenched, you know, voices from different spheres that really want to change the conversation. You know, so Dr. Finkenauer's example of Scared Straight, I mean, that's a great example. And having grown up, you know, with that program, I remember people joking about this in high school. You know, you know, it was almost like the Say No to Drugs campaign. You know, like it's you know everybody just thought it was funny that they thought this was actually going to work. You know, and it was like common knowledge among the people who were supposed to be actually affected by the program that it wasn't working. You know, and that's probably before the science showed that, you know, but of course you have the entrenched voices. They built an institution around the program. They don't want to lose the program. So they're fighting against, you know, the scientific conclusions that have resulted. And then they're exploiting any kind of disagreement or even just something that they don't understand, that the public doesn't understand about the science. And they'll take that thing they don't understand and say, oh, well, that proves the scientists are full of it. You know, I mean, the way that Dr. Fauci in the United States around the coronavirus has been vilified by certain political camps because maybe at one time he said, oh, you don't need to wear a mask, and then later he said you need to wear a mask. Well, lots of things changed in the interim, right? It may be that the data has changed. It may be that the virus has gotten more serious and has spread more. You know, part of the issue isn't even, when we're talking about coronavirus, part of the issue isn't just that people don't understand the science. They don't seem to understand the math. Right? I mean, it's not just a matter of science. It's like you're talking about exponential increase in numbers. That's a basic mathematical issue, but again, people are saying, well, he said don't wear masks before, and now he says to wear masks. He must not know what he's talking about, or maybe he's being paid by the Democrats or whatever other conspiracy theory they associate with it. And what they're doing is kind of exploiting that scientific, miscommunication or failure on the part of scientists to communicate their results to the public, and they're exploiting that because they have another agenda. And it reminds me of fictional, years ago, there was a television series called Mad Men that was a fictional representation of people in the advertising business. And it took place in the 1960s, and there was a scene around the release of the Surgeon General's report about smoking and the dangers of smoking. And the main advertising executive was advising a cigarette company how to advertise their product in the face of the Surgeon General's report. And he's asking, he doesn't know how they make cigarettes. He's like, tell me a little bit about your process. And he's saying, explaining the process. And in the process, he says, oh, well, the tobacco is I forget the phrase he used, something like filtered, I don't know, grass filtered or something like that. I'm making that up, but something along those lines. And he says, okay, well, great. What you need to do is say, our cigarettes are grass filtered. This is, this is the selling point that you're going to use. And the guy laughs. The guy from the tobacco company says, well, the competitors, cigarettes are filtered this way too. Like, why does that make us special? And the advertising guy goes, no, Your competitors' cigarettes cause cancer. And what that really drives home, right, is the idea that they're telling stories. And of course, this guy works in advertising. He has, an investment in telling the story a particular way to help his client and to hurt the other clients. So the scientific information doesn't change because it's one brand of cigarettes or the other, right? What changes is the story that's being told around those. And I think when we think about these other examples, coronavirus and people arguing about masks, I'm thinking of 2006 in the climate change conversation. There was a climate gate, right? And what happened was, Russian computer hackers, I guess, found a trove of emails and made them public, emails between climate scientists, and they were talking smack about other scientists, and whatever they were saying that people have in private, conversations they think are going to remain private about what's going on, the politics of the field, et cetera, et cetera. And so they exposed these emails, and then they used that as evidence for the claim that there was no climate change. Essentially, they were saying, well, climate change is a hoax, and this is proof because these scientists are arguing with each other and sort of gossiping and talking smack or whatever. And that became the dominant narrative of the day in the press about climate change was, oh, ClimateGate, all these climate scientists are actually lying, there must be some conspiracy going on. And it took the climate scientists themselves weeks to actually respond to any of this. So in the meantime, a narrative built up around climate change in the public eye that started to see all these climate scientists as liars, as hoaxers, et cetera. And then by the time the scientists themselves had an official response, it was almost too late. Like that narrative had already been written and structured around that. And so that's how the public was responding to it. And then, 6 different evaluative institutions looked at these emails and came to the conclusion that there was no manipulation of the science going on, right? That this was just sort of ordinary, like I said, people talking smack. This wasn't something that had an impact on the science where they were distorting the science. There was no distortion going on. But by the time all that, information came out, it was too late, at least for that group of people who wanted to disbelieve the science. And I think we're very definitely seeing the same thing with coronavirus right now. The way that they're taking, something that happens in the scientific community or some disagreement. And by the way, we saw this earlier with evolution, right? The science of evolution is pretty well established, right? That evolution, evolution of species is a fact. And in fact, the whole, all of modern biology is built on the reality of evolution. So if evolution is wrong, right, a lot of other things that we believe in biology would be wrong as well. But of course, we have, a group of people called creationists that want to challenge evolution. They don't think evolution is consistent with the Bible. And so what they do is they find, well, here's a scientific study that shows that what we once believed about the evolution between 2 particular species is no longer true, right? This experiment shows that particular belief was false. And so the creationists pick up on that small scientific disagreement about a particularity of evolution and say, well, this shows, scientists don't agree about evolution. So perhaps intelligent design is right. Perhaps creationism is right. So they take this, and again, it's a kind of propaganda campaign. They tell a different story because they have an ultimate purpose. Their purpose is not to find the truth. Their purpose is to promote creationism or to promote anti-climate, change science or whatever. And ultimately, I think one of the problems is that in scientific research, there is an assumption that we are having a conversation to find the truth and to build our knowledge. And unfortunately, that conversation is being disrupted by people who have a different perspective, right? Their goal is not necessarily to find the truth, but their goal is to, prove a different point. Right. So they've already reached a conclusion. And instead of being willing to be wrong, if they see evidence that contradicts that conclusion, instead, they will twist whatever is out there to promote the conclusion that they wanted to promote anyway. I see my time has run out. So yeah.
Thank you, Professor Bernardo Attias. And we give the floor to Professor Maxim Lepskiy.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово. Было очень интересно слушать моих коллег, поскольку всегда интересно послушать профессуру, которую уважаешь, и работах, о которых достаточно много знаешь.
Thank you for giving me the floor. It was extremely interesting for me to hear what my colleagues have got to say, especially when these are peoples that you respect and to the works of whom you follow.
Как и профессор Крас, я не очень люблю количественные исследования, а больше люблю качественные исследования в социологии.
Just like Professor Krase, I'm inclined to conduct more qualitative researches in my sociological activity rather quantitative.
Потому что очень часто после интерпретации операторы, которые мы исследуем с помощью количественных измерений, могут меняться.
For the reason that after the interpretation of the results, a lot of researches that were conducted by means of quantitative research, the exponents of that research might change.
Потому что люди учитывают уже проведенное исследование.
Because people regard the research that was already conducted.
Второй момент, который снижает возможность количественных исследований, это не только обратная связь, но и не всегда точные статистические данные.
The second aspect why I'm not inclined toward quantitative research results is not only because of the less feedback that we receive, but also because usually we do not always receive correct statistical outcomes.
Мы всегда для паспортички, где демографическая, профессиональная, шли в управление статистики, чтобы получить самые свежие данные. И всегда спрашивали, насколько они доверяют проведенным статистическим исследованиям.
When we are facing a situation when we have to rely on quantitative data, we always go to a special bureau that deals with statistics and receive their results and always ask them, to what extent do you trust this statistics?
Например, в Украине перепись населения не проводилась с 2000 года, и за 20 лет все серьезно изменилось.
For instance, in Ukraine, they haven't done the research on the number of population, the factual number of population since 2000, and in the course of 20 years, a lot has changed.
Хочу привести еще два кейса, которые в чем-то схожи и отличны с моими коллегами.
And I would like to provide examples of two cases that are in some aspects that are relatable to what colleagues have said, and in some aspects it's not.
У нас училась студентка, которая работала в пенитенциарной системе, в тюрьме.
We had a student that used to work in penitentiary institution.
И она провела первое социологическое исследование с большими трудностями в вопросе как тех людей, которые сидят, так и, собственно, тех, которые охраняют.
And her first sociological research in penitentiary was extremely difficult, both regarding the imprisoned people and people that are that observe those people, basically the administration.
Потом к нам пришли все сотрудники пенитенциарной системы, чтобы получить переподготовку.
Повышение квалификации, да, их?
Повышение квалификации, да.
Afterwards, all of the employees of that penitentiary institution came to us, and they said that we have to go through a program that would raise our qualifications.
Как выяснилось, все работают с защитой тех людей, которые сидят, но забывают, что те, кто охраняют, за решеткой находятся тоже очень много времени.
Можете, пожалуйста, еще раз перефразировать? Я не поняла.
Очень много правозащитных организаций защищают заключенных. Да,
As a result, we found out that a lot of agencies, NGOs, they pay so much attention to the criminals that are imprisoned, and people that are actually working in the prison, they get less and less attention, and they're not that qualified. Nobody pays due attention to them.
Люди, которые охраняют, по сути, оказались менее защищены.
And it turned out, the research showed that people that are in charge of observing and watching those imprisoners are less secure than imprisoned.
Невозможно решить проблему улучшения ситуации, не решив проблемы обеих сторон, как заключенных, так и тех, кто охраняет.
And it is impossible to improve the situation without dealing and looking into both sides, to people that observe people and work in the administration of the prison and imprisons people as well.
В конце люди в погонах нам говорили, что мы думали, ученые это те, кто бегают с очком, ловят бабочек в коротких шортиках.
And at the end of the research, people that are wearing the uniform, figuratively speaking, they told that we thought that scientists are people that basically try to catch the butterflies. That's what they do.
Мы им объяснили, что все несколько иначе.
And Professor Maxim Levski said that we explained them that things are different. We are not doing nothing.
Они благодарили нас как за глоток свежего воздуха.
And at the end of that study, people working in the penitentiary institution, they were so thankful to the scholars for giving them just a fresh air, just a hope.
Второй кейс не такой серьезный, он также связан с курением.
And the second case that I would like to share is not as serious as the former one, but it is related to smoking.
Один из моих друзей преподает социологию массовых коммуникаций и рекламу.
One of my friends and colleagues, he teaches sociology of mass communications and commercials.
Он страшный курильщик.
And he is a very heavy smoker.
И я студентам сказал, они очень верят в технологию рекламы и маркетинга. Я им сказал, что я поставлю отлично любому, кто сможет с помощью рекламных технологий или социологии массовой коммуникации отучить этого преподавателя от курения.
And since my students, they are big believers in the technology and the commercials themselves, the way commercials affect people. And Professor Lepskiy said, I'm going to put straight A to a student who would be able, by means of the commercials as a tool, to make that professor a non-smoker, to make him stop smoking.
За 20 лет никому из студентов это не удалось.
And in the course of 20 years, none of my students succeeded in that.
Поэтому факты, конечно, нужно проверять как собственную теорию.
And what I'm trying to say that certainly facts should be verified and examined just the way the theories must be verified.
Спасибо за внимание и спасибо за интереснейшую дискуссию.
Thank you very much for the attention, dear colleagues, and thank you very much for their interesting discussion. Thank you, dear scholars. Our panel is coming to the end. Does anybody want to say a final word in the course of 1 or 2 minutes? Very short word. If anybody does, please. No, nobody. All right then. On this point, we are finishing our online panel discussion. This is the final panel of the conference. I would like to express gratitude on behalf of entire organizing and scientific committee of the conference. I would like to also express the gratitude to Dr. Oleg Maltsev, who is not with us today, but for the opportunity and for creating conditions to make this conference possible. And thank you every speaker, dear speaker, for such an interesting discussion, for sharing so many cases that are so important and should be made public. And in the course of several weeks, as usual, once the resolution of the conference and the collected papers book is ready, every speaker is going to be notified accordingly. I wish everybody to have a great day and great evening for some, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
До свидания.
Thank you.
До свидания.
you.